We see high levels of abuse in the aesthetic sports, figure skating, gymnastics. And I think the reason is because they enter into it at a very young age, and there's the demand and expectation of obedience. And when you demand obedience, it is ripe for abuse of power.
Welcome to the Bulletproof Musician Podcast, where you'll learn how to practice more effectively and perform better under pressure with insights from expert musicians and the latest research in performance psychology.
So I've met a number of musicians over the years who have described experiences they've had in music as traumatic. For some, it's been repeated, like really negative performances from a young age that left them feeling shame and embarrassment and have even affected how they see themselves many years later in adulthood. For others, it's been psychologically or emotionally abusive teachers who have threatened or manipulated or belittled or publicly shamed their students, whether intentionally or otherwise. And then there are those singular moments that blindside us, like a very public memory slip or maybe even getting rejected from the schools you fully expected to get into, that musicians may not necessarily label as being traumatic, but years later still seem to have some lingering effects. So I wondered if a good place for us to begin might be just the question, like, what is trauma and what is not trauma? And I asked specifically because I've had students or clients who will describe their experiences as feeling or being traumatic, but then on the other hand, they're also uncomfortable labeling these experiences as being like true trauma because they don't feel like they were severe or extreme enough to be deserving of whatever they think that label signifies.
It's an interesting question, though, because one of the big problems that we deal with trauma is shame and guilt, right? So then you have people who had something happen to them. They're affected by it some way. They're probably embarrassed by it, maybe even ashamed. But then they're ashamed because they're not allowed to call this trauma because it's not traumatic enough. I think when we talk about trauma, we need to understand a couple of things. Number one, we're talking about a very personal experience, right? So if you and I and 100 other people experience the same thing, some of us might experience it as traumatizing and some may not. And I think that the easiest way to describe trauma in layman's terms is you have a situation that leads to danger, physical or psychological danger, and it has a lasting impact on your functioning. Right now, that's vague enough, but it's vague for a reason. Because there are some times that people are seriously impacted by something that when I hear the story, I'm like, wow, I didn't think that would be so impactful to them. And there's other times that people have gone through war and hell and up and down the mountain, and they come out relatively unscathed. And so I think that the simplest way to start is to understand that trauma is really in the eyes of the recipient. And I think it's also important for us to remember that if we're going to talk about trauma, we're going to be talking about things that make people uncomfortable sometimes. And we should be sensitive to that. Now, we don't want to be so overwhelmed by discussions about trauma that we find ourselves fleeing from the conversation, because that's what actually empowers the traumatic response to continue cycle and get stronger. But I'm also sensitive to the fact that everybody has their own levels of tolerance. And so in the course of this conversation, if it becomes too heated for people and they feel the need to step away, that's fine. I understand. I encourage people to take care of themselves. And certainly in the treatment of trauma, the main theme is one of empowerment. So I hope that people find this informative and useful and maybe even mildly entertaining. But if they do experience this as traumatizing and overwhelming, they should feel free to take a break and step away because we need to take care of ourselves. So I think if we accept the fact that trauma is a personal thing, it creates kind of this paradigm where nobody has the right to tell someone else that something is not traumatic. However, I'm not an expert in musicians. I've worked with some. I've worked with a lot of athletes. I've never worked with a curling athlete. So my point is that I'm an expert in trauma and I'm an expert in anger. And those are my areas of expertise inside sport and performance psychology. But there are going to be niches inside there that I'm not expert at. And because I'm also clinically trained, I'm very sensitive to the fact that in order for trauma to be considered a diagnosable trauma, you have to have symptoms that are related to it, related to what happened, They're pervasive, they're over time, and they interfere with your performance in life some way. Now, it's interesting because there are times that things can impact our lives and change our trajectory and our view of things, but we don't have any of the traditional PTSD symptoms of it. We don't have flashbacks, nightmares, intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, any of those things, but they are somewhere in the back of our mind and afraid that this might happen again. I would say that I don't consider that traumatic. I consider it impactful, but I don't consider it traumatic. When I think about traumatic, I think about circumstances that lead to a change in functioning. It can be clinical in the purpose of raising to the point of developing these symptoms. And in our conversation, we could talk about what those symptoms are and how they come to be. There are people that have subclinical manifestations of trauma-related issues. And there are a lot of people who go through life after bad things happen to them and they're impacted, but they're not damaged. In fact, I would even go so far as to say that the goal of all treatment is about empowerment, and we're trying to get people from a position where they think that they're broken to repaired. The metaphor that I often use is going from scabs to scars. So if something bad happens to you, you get hurt, you bleed, you develop a scab. Well, while you have that scab, if you scratch it, you'll bleed again. Right? That's what's happening when you're symptomatic related to a traumatic event. The goal is over time, that scab turns into a scar. You still have the remnant that it happened, but you scratch it and you don't bleed anymore. And I often, and it might sound counterintuitive to some people, but I often prescribe anger for people that have had traumatic impact for two reasons. Number one, most of the symptoms that people have related to trauma are anxiety-based, which is about running away. And I'm about attacking the problem. And the way you attack the problem is you say, listen, as long as you're still messed up by that person that did those things to you is still got influence over you. Aren't you freaking tired of that? Aren't you ready to take your life back? And that can be the motivation that gets people to do the work. Because when someone really has traumatic symptoms, it's very difficult. You can't force someone. They have to do it when they're ready. But one of my mentors, David Pelkovitz, who is just like a walking catchphrase, one of the things he said about trauma is, if you're going to do the work, you're going to pay, meaning it's hard. You could pay now or you could pay later. But if you pay later, you pay with interest. So the longer people wait to address the issues that have impacted them, the harder it's going to be.
You used the word danger earlier, and I don't remember the exact context in which you described it in terms of your definition of trauma. I'm wondering how much of this is real versus perceived danger, related also to the idea of does age matter?
Absolutely.
Right? I think our sense of what's dangerous changes maybe as we grow or mature and what we experience in life. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit to that combination.
Brilliant. Yes, absolutely. Well, first off, danger is exactly what you said. It's perceived. It doesn't have to be real. And in fact, the difference between anxiety and fear is whether or not you're really in danger or you're perceiving yourself to be in danger when you're not. So if I have a fear of spiders, a phobia of spiders, it's anxiety related to some incident. Usually it's like, a spider was walking on me and I got scared. People usually aren't even bitten or really harmed, but they become terrified of it. Well, now you're anxious of the spider and the spider's not even in the room. Right? The analogy that I sometimes use to give people imagery is, imagine you're on a boat, right? Perfectly seagoing vessel, no problem. You don't have to worry about sinking. You're safe. And all of a sudden you start to see sharks in the water. And you're like, oh, shit, this is getting scary. Then you see blood in the water. Now you're getting even more upset. And I would say, all right, are you afraid? And they'd say, yeah. And I say, nope, you're anxious. Fear would be if you're in the water. Anxiety is when you're on the boat. You're perceiving danger when you don't have danger. The developmental issue is also important in another way, because what you said, is exactly right, that people become afraid of different things over time. And when you're a kid, everybody is big. So you're scared of people and respect and authority. And I would even go so far as to say that one of the reasons why athletes and performers are at risk for mental health issues in general, including trauma, is because we presume because people function high in certain domains, they function high in all domains. And that's not true, not necessarily. But I would take it even further and to say, because we see high levels of abuse in the aesthetic sports, figure skating, gymnastics. And I think the reason is because they enter into it at a very young age, and there is the demand and expectation of obedience. And when you demand obedience, it is ripe for abuse of power. That doesn't mean that because teachers and coaches expect people to be obedient when they're teaching you, that means therefore they're abusive. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that when there is a paradigm that demands obedience, it sets the stage that if somebody who has the upper hand chooses to abuse that power, it's very easy for them to do so. So that's another issue about age, but yet there's one more. I'm probably jumping ahead, and it might wind up being later in the conversation, but personality disorders are developed as a result of traumatizing events when the person is very young. In fact, I can almost predict, no, not almost, I can predict with fair reliability that the age that somebody is exposed to chronic trauma is going to be predictive of whether or not they have a personality disorder, depending on the age that it happened to them. The younger they are, before their personality is set and their object relations is set, which is a psychobabble word that means their ability to form healthy, understandable relationships with other people, the more likely they're going to wind up with personality disorders because their understanding of self and others is not yet developed. Versus if this happens later in life, it doesn't mean that you won't be impacted by it, but it won't lead to the significant distorted direction that your personality goes if you're traumatized while you're in your personality development. So age is an important issue. And it's not just chronological age, it's psychological age. And so there are some people that are like 5, 6, 7 years old and they're, loquacious and talented and feel better around adults, but they're still 5, 6, or 7, right? Then there's other people that are like 20 and you're like, I feel like I'm talking to a 5-year-old. And so, the point I'm just making is that chronological age does not reliably predict psychological age.
I wonder if you could take a moment to say a little bit more about when you say personality disorders, like what sorts of things are you talking about? What sorts of behaviors or characteristics might we be seeing with somebody who is experiencing something like that?
Well, the thing that to understand about personality disorders is that if you pick up, actually I have it here, if you pick up the DSM-5, right, which is the most recent version of the diagnostic Bible, if you will, and you read through the personality disorders, most people will go, oh no, that's me. And it's not. The thing to understand about personality disorders, it's not about having these symptoms sometimes. It's about the frequency, the duration of them, the intensity of them. And so personality disorders have to do with people's views of the world and their ability to interact with the world in a reasonable fashion. So narcissistic personality disorders are folks that believe that they are better than the world and everyone is there to be used. They're simply, you're there for my use. But even inside that, many narcissists are actually compensatory narcissists. They try to convince the world they're the best, but their insecurities are showing for everyone to see, right? Borderline personality disorder is a personality disorder where people have significant fears of attachment and abandonment. And again, if you read borderline personality disorder criteria, if you go to WebMD or pick up the DSM, anybody who cares about any relationship they're in, they read it, they can go, oh crap, that's me. It's not. It has to do with pervasive patterns of relationship problems, fear of abandonment, suicidal ideation, significant problems with emotion regulation and being able to have healthy relationships. So they'll desire relationships, but they're so afraid that they're going to be abandoned that they push people away before they get a chance to even get attached. People with those types of personality disorders often tend to vacillate. We call this splitting. Day one, you're my teacher. I come to see you and you're the best thing since sliced bread. I'm so happy that you're my teacher. And then I'm worried, oh no, I might have said the wrong thing and he's not going to want to be my teacher anymore. And the next day I come back and I'm like, I never liked you anyway. And you're like, wow, it's like, it's this disconnect. But there are several different types of personality disorders. There's antisocial personality disorder, which has to do with a certain recklessness and not caring about social norms and lying and stealing and those types of things. But the point I'm making is that personality disorders are comparably rare, but there's nothing that magically protects a performer from not developing mental illness, from not developing personality disorders, from not being exposed to traumatic events. And so when you first reached out to me, I thought to myself, oh my God, this is so important, because there are people that are walking around not knowing why they're struggling, but they know that they're struggling. They think that they're crazy. They think that they're alone in the world. And when you're able to say, no, you're not, well, maybe you are crazy, because we're all crazy. We need to normalize and validate this, right? We all have our own little, idiosyncrasies and such. But I would tell you, no, the thing that happens most powerfully for me when someone comes to see me for trauma and they say, well, doc, I have A, B, and C symptoms. And I say, that's interesting. Do you also have D, E, and F? And they go, holy crap, how'd you know that? Well, because you're not the first person that's had these symptoms. These symptoms tend to go together. This is how the mind works in response to traumatic events. And not only do we understand that those go together, we also know what works to help them. And so often the best improvement between any consecutive sessions is between session 1 and session 2, because they walk out with hope. Now, don't forget, they also had to build up the courage to come get help in the first place. So let's not minimize that. So, but when they come in and they're afraid that they're damaged and tortured and crazy and all of these other self-deprecating terms, and they're told, it's okay. You had some bad shit happen to you. And how you're functioning is understandable considering the circumstances. We often use another David Pelkovitz phrase is abnormal reactions to abnormal situations is normal behavior. And so it's very much about empowering people and helping them understand that life isn't easy. No matter how talented you might be in this area, you still might be struggling in other areas. And the more we can raise awareness and get people empowered to help themselves, the more they're going to be able to perform in all areas of their life at a much higher level.
I wonder if you can paint a picture or say a little bit more about what the experience of someone who's experienced trauma might be after the fact, in terms of, what are some of the things that they describe to you if they come and work with you, or that you've noticed in other athletes or performers are exhibiting or experiencing after trauma?
Good question, but I have to answer it 2 ways. One is how the normal average person, non-performer, presents, and then how it looks different with performers and athletes, because there are a lot of things in our cultures that change the performance of trauma. I mean, people actually act a different way. So I'll explain that in a second. But even if we consider the first place, how people respond to trauma really depends on it's a bifurcation. One way is when you are traumatized in a way that your brain malfunctions, all right? This is a result of a spike in cortisol, which is a stress hormone, and it interferes with how your brain works. So normally, if something bad happens, I should be able to tell you, well, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. Those people have a lot of difficulty with that, because the part of your brain called the hippocampus, which is responsible for storing memories, which is right next to the amygdala, which is your emotion center, the hippocampus stops working right. And so you don't remember things the same way. In fact, instead of storing your story as a narrative, you store it as sensory packets. So someone might not be able to tell you the sequence of what happened, but I remember the bad breath that guy had when he was yelling at me. Or I remember my muscles in my legs getting tight because I was so stressed by it. Or things that they hear or things that they see, but it's sensory packets, not narrative. Those people that have that type of reaction wind up with flashbacks, which is the experience of reliving what happened in real time right now, like it's happening right now. Nightmares, which are basically flashbacks while you're sleeping. However, nightmares can also be symbolic nightmares. That it's not hard for the psychologist to realize, I know where that came from, but you might think that it's completely bizarre because it's a metaphor for power and vulnerability. And then there's also intrusive thoughts. The reason why it's important to understand those symptoms different from the other symptoms is that if you experience those, if you don't treat those right, then you won't be able to fix the other problems. And the interesting thing about it is those symptoms, those re-experiencing symptoms, are your mind's way of trying to master it. So if you've had, I don't know, a piece that you've been practicing, whether it's, new piece of, sheet music that someone gave you, or you're adjusting from one instrument to another, and then all of a sudden you just have a bad outcome, you don't just quit. You usually say, all right, I need more reps. I gotta practice my way through this. In fact, in the sport world, baseball players, when they go through a slump, which I don't believe in slumps, we could talk about that later. Baseball players start coming up with all kinds of magical, superstitious things, right? I have to scratch my crotch 3 times or take a shower in my uniform. Basketball players know the only way you get through a slump is you have to shoot through it. And most performers know, all right, I need guided practice to get through this, right? That's how you master it. That's what mastery is all about. Well, these re-experiencing symptoms is your brain trying to master the trauma, but it gets too scary, so you run away before you get to the end of the story. That's why the treatment for those types of symptoms is something called exposure therapy, where they are, obviously, they have to consent to do so, but they're told if you can get through the narrative from the beginning to the end, and Edna Foer was the person who really developed prolonged exposure therapy the best, and now it's like 8 to 12 sessions. You get through that, and those re-experiencing symptoms go away. Now, you still might have other drama, right? You might have a hyperreactivity, an exaggerated startle response. You might have some low-level paranoia. If someone hurts you, you start believing other people are going to hurt you as well. But the point I'm making, though, is that those re-experiencing symptoms, if they're there, they need to be treated with exposure therapy. Otherwise, they're not going to go away. But then there's all of this other stuff about sense of self, managing emotions, understanding how you see the world differently, cognitive distortions that go along with it. And so that's how I bifurcate trauma symptoms to begin with. Actually, it's also important to consider in both situations, you might see people dissociate. And dissociation, in the grand scheme of things, is becoming disconnected in reality. Now, sometimes when people are dissociating, they're dissociating and abreacting, meaning having an emotional reaction to what they think is going on in real time, even though it's not. And then there's other times people might be dissociating as a coping mechanism to get out of here. It's really important to understand that because there are times that someone might be dissociating and you not realizing it, and you're asking them a question and you're thinking they're ignoring you. They're not there. They're not there. And this is why it's so important for people to understand what trauma may look like, because if you decide that you're going to try to, hey, give me your attention, now they're going to feel like they're being re-traumatized again, and they might become violent to you or to themselves. Similar to how a Vietnam vet might become dangerous if they're in the middle of a flashback and someone walks into the room with a loud voice. I just think you're someone I'm fighting with. Another reason why it's important is sports psychologists use imagery and visualization a lot as a tool to help people get more reps and master their craft. Well, people that have trauma histories are prone to flashbacks, nightmares, dissociation. And so if you decide to do an imagery and visualization exercise, a lot of what I know, I learned the hard way. I had a young lady I was working with, and I was teaching her the beach scene relaxation exercise as a way to help her ground herself and relax herself, having no idea that she was sexually assaulted on a beach. Let me tell you, that didn't go very well, right? And so if we're going to use imagery and visualization, we need to be mindful and sensitive that you're going to walk around someone's mind. You better get permission and be sensitive to the fact that you might find some places that you didn't expect to be. And actually, Dr. Allison Pope-Rodius offered a very good suggestion when I was talking about this, which is if you're going to do imagery and visualization, you're probably going to want to ask the person, are there any particular things that you think we should avoid when we're doing imagery and visualization? I love doing something for 25 years and thinking like I'm an expert, and I talk about something and someone pops up with an idea that's better than anything I was working with. So I was like, yes, absolutely, Allison, great. I'm stealing that and going to take that on the road. So we need to be mindful that it can present of lots of different ways, and it can be very scary for both the survivor of the trauma as well as the person that's working with them. But let me also spend a moment talking about how culture of performers impacts how people might look different when they've had traumatic events happen to them. There is no steadfast rule, but if there's one rule to live by, it's look for change. If they come in looking exhausted and they're normally wide-eyed, bushy-tailed, ready to go, it might just be that their alarm clock didn't go off. It might be that they're having nightmares and having difficulty sleeping, or they're avoiding going to sleep because they're afraid that the nightmares might come. People that normally are very social, but now they're isolated, notice significant changes in weight. Survivors of sexual abuse, often you see this, that they'll go one way or the other. And by the way, you should know that research shows that about 1 in 4 females will be exposed to some type of sexual assault or sexual abuse over the course of their lives, which is horrific. But there's also some research that shows that the numbers are about 1 in 6 in boys, which means it happens a whole lot more than anybody realizes. And then you have this situation where people might change the way they're doing things in order to make this less likely to happen. Especially when you're young, when traumatic things happen, you have this innocent, naive belief that this was somehow your fault, when it wasn't. Especially when it's sexual abuse, you don't even understand sexuality, and things you're being exposed to it. But what we often see with survivors of sexual abuse, sometimes they will gain weight deliberately, either for one of two reasons. There may be many other reasons, but the two things that come to my mind immediately is, one, they start self-medicating with food. And the other is, I'm going to try to make myself unattractive. As if that's why this happened in the first place. This is as ridiculous as a woman who's sexually assaulted thinking, oh, if I didn't wear this skirt, or I didn't have a beer, or I wasn't in this place. The responsibility goes to the perpetrator, not the victim. But nonetheless, these are thoughts that victims often struggle with, that what did I contribute to? And by the way, some of that is also so that they have some sense of control, because ultimately this is about the fear of loss of control. But the other might happen as well, that the person might deliberately lose weight. Well, let me say deliberately. Intentionally or unintentionally, they are taking actions that lead them to lose weight. That could either be because I want to stop puberty from happening. I don't want to be sexualized. Or I may not be able to control what goes on in the world, but I can control what goes into my mouth. And so I'm going to stop eating, or decrease eating, or restrict my eating as a method of control. And so things might present themselves in many different ways with persons, including the fact, and I'm sure that this exists with performers, but it probably manifests itself in different ways. You know, we have a very inconsistent message that we give young people, young performers, young athletes about emotion. You're not supposed to celebrate. You should act like you've been there before, but now you look like a robot. Why aren't you happy? Aren't you enjoying this? I just did my 10,000 hours of practice in order to become a virtuoso. I'd like to go take a nap. We don't do a good job of really empowering people to feel what they feel. So I think that there are things inside the performance culture, including the athlete culture, that suppresses emotions. And so if you have an environment that suppresses emotions, and your emotions are all over the place and really dysregulated following trauma sometimes, guess what? They're either going to be spilling over and looking uncharacteristically emotional, something that we don't accept in this studio, or they'll double down and be even more obedient, more apologetic. I'm sorry, I will do whatever you want. And because they're so worried that they're going to be found out and shamed or whatever, they become the ultimate pleaser, which some teachers might value that and relish that, not knowing what they're looking at. I'm kind of jumping all over the place a little bit, but I guess the reason I'm doing so is I have a lot to say, but more importantly, trauma is not linear. It doesn't just present in one way. And so as many different ways that you could think about how a performer that you're working with looks, variations off that theme, you have to consider at least a possibility that they experience something traumatic. And by the way, as we said before, it doesn't require sexual abuse in order for something to be traumatizing. It can be being shamed in public, being worried about being isolated. Bullying happens a lot, where kids are just, they don't want to come to dance. They don't want to do the things that they normally loved. And so what I'm trying to just share is that not every bad thing that happens to people leads to traumatic symptoms. In fact, not only do we know that if we had a room of 100 people, some people will become very symptomatic, some people won't. We also know that some people that will become symptomatic will get better all by themselves. So we should not underestimate people's resilience, but we should also recognize people's fragility. And sometimes people need to be seen and heard and valued and given a space to talk about what's going on so that they can master whatever they're struggling with in a pro-social way. Because the last thing you want is, if bad things have happened to you, you don't want that to define you nor your life. Although people can often get stuck in that cycle, I think.
Yeah, I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how it is that these cycles are maintained. This may or may not be entirely related to that, but for instance, I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how experience of trauma can relate to one's identity or sense of self. I think you mentioned shame previously. You mentioned feeling worthless.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that you mentioned this idea of feeling broken or that there's something secretly fundamentally wrong with oneself. But some of these things that I've heard associated with trauma, I wonder if you could speak to the relationship and again, how these things are maintained over time.
Well, I think the easiest part to start with that question is the issue of how they're maintained. And the simple answer is this. The symptom is a failed attempt at solving the problem. So if I know that getting through the whole narrative is the way to get the symptoms under control, but every time I start going through the narrative, I get scared and I run away. Guess what? That running away gets reinforced because I feel better that I don't have to go through this crap anymore. So the symptom, while it's an attempt to get through things, you get reinforced by avoiding. It's one of the reasons why anxiety disorders can get out of control, because anxiety is about, well, first off, it's about the fear of loss of control, and control is an illusion anyway, right? But if I'm dealing with a situation where I'm terrified, whether it's rational or not, and I can remove myself, then guess what? I'm going to feel better. If I feel better, now I'm reinforcing myself for avoidance. And Nick Saban, the former head coach of Alabama, said it really, really well. There is no greatness without going through hard stuff. And he wasn't talking about trauma necessarily, but you're not going to get to your potential if you always take the easy way. And I mean that from an overall training point of view. You give me two people that are equally talented, the one who wants to work hard, the person who's more disciplined, the person who has goals or where they want, they're going to beat the person. In fact, you give, hard work beats talent when talent doesn't work hard, right? So what we want to do is we want to help people realize, yeah, of course it's hard. And that's what makes it worth it. People that have not gone through traumatic events will tell you, there's a lot of things that I'm trying to achieve that are really hard. And I would say, yeah, the harder it is, the more rewarding it is when you master it. And you could say the same thing for managing your traumatic symptoms.
When you say narrative, would it be possible to give a specific, maybe even a sports example of what that narrative, or even outside of sports, like what that narrative would mean or look like to get to the end of it?
Sure. So trauma is generally broken down into two types, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is single event, horrible thing, really, really bad, which tends to lead to simple PTSD, which is the traditional PTSD that people know about. And type 2 is repeated traumas over time. So a season-ending injury especially a gruesome one, might be a type 1 trauma. Being berated by your teacher over a long period of time would be a type 2 trauma. And you might not see the traditional symptoms of flashbacks, nightmares, and intrusive thoughts, but you'll see the damaged sense of self, the low-level paranoia, the hypervigilance of always looking over your shoulder, the sense of feeling broken. And so we should be mindful of how that might look in two different ways. So a narrative for type 1 trauma might be, just using a season-ending injury, for example. A narrative is the story from beginning to end, right? So I'll do the very short version so that for the purposes of illustrating it. All right, so can you tell me what happened that day that you had that really bad accident? Sure, I went through my whole routine as I normally do. I got up to hit. It was, the third inning, and I hit a line drive to right center field. And as I was turning from first base going to second, I heard a crack and my leg cracked like that, and I had a bone exposed. And then they just stopped talking. They say, okay, well, then what? They have difficulty telling you what happened from there. And the reason is because now they're having a traumatic shock response. That's the part where the hippocampus shut off, right? But the continuation of the narrative would be the trainer came out, the coach came out, they tried to comfort me, 911 was called. I remember I was in the ambulance. They took me to the hospital. I remember seeing the lights in the emergency room, and I could smell blood, and then they gave me medication and everything felt better. And then they gave me anesthesia, and they set the fracture, and then I woke up with a cast on my leg. That would be a narrative, right? And so people that have had these severe episodes have a place where the narrative breaks. And pardon the pun, because he had a fractured leg, but the idea is that if you can get them through their whole narrative, the flashbacks and the nightmares become disempowered because your brain is trying to master it. The same way as you try to master a piece that you've been working on for a while, and you get this one place that you always, that damn pinky doesn't get where it's supposed to be, and your teacher's over you, come on, and this is why, one of the most common questions or common themes that I deal with these days, there is a real division between coaches and athletes these days. And when I say athletes, I haven't seen as much with performers, but I know it's happening there too. Which is with the increased awareness of mental health issues. And we're nowhere near where we need to be, but it's a lot better than it used to be. There's a lot of people that are coming forward and saying, I was abused. And there are a lot of coaches that are saying, bullshit. I did not abuse you. This was not abuse. And so what people will ask me is, where's that fine line between hard coaching and abuse? And the answer is, Coach, you don't know. They know. And if you're not sure, then you want to adjust. I was talking to someone about this recently. I don't believe that most coaches and teachers that are abusive are sadistic, horrible people. I believe most of them think their methods work, and they have worked, because what I might experience as overwhelming abusive coaching, you might think that's exactly what I need to get me motivated. And come on, how often do we have an athlete that you see a ton of talent, or a performer has a ton of talent, but they don't have the work ethic? And you're like, you're not getting the reps. I can tell because you're sloppy. You're not as refined as you need to be. And this is because you're not polished, you're not repping. And the teacher knows, and the teacher's probably even right. And for some performers, they're like, I got to take the teacher seriously. And the parents are like, I'm paying money for the teacher. You better do what the teacher says. Well, but what happens if it's the teacher's not just doing that, but the teacher's now attacking your sense of self? It's one thing to be a bad piano player. It's another thing to be a piece of shit, right? It's another thing. And that's why when we talk about parenting, you want to focus on the behavior the child's doing that you have a problem with, not attacking their character. You're not a bad kid. What you did is a problem. There's a difference. And so I think that is going to be an ongoing thing that we struggle with, because a lot of coaches are leaving coaching because they're worried that they're being accused of being abusive, when they have pretty hard practices that have been effective over time, but that doesn't mean that they work for everyone. I think the best coaches and the best teachers are the ones that recognize what they're good at, what they're not good at. They continue to try to improve, and they tailor their methods to be most receptive, or to get their students to be most responsive. Colin Yanov, who I've done a couple of podcasts with, who's really so insightful and really asks good questions. He would often talk about what his experience has been with different coaches over time. And the best coaches are the ones that are able to get the most out of you. That's the bottom line. Coaches are in a vulnerable position. Teachers are in a vulnerable position because it's not just about getting paid. It's about their reputation as well. And their livelihood is based off of success. Okay, well, would you be okay with, all right, you got 9 out of 10 kids that you're working with to become 100% better, but that one person's hospitalized because you mercilessly teased them. Is that worth it? I don't think so. But because it's such a personal experience, you have to have an environment that allows the student, the performer, the athlete to be able to talk and set limits around what they're not comfortable with. And that's very, very difficult. That's why I said before, when you're in a culture where obedience is expected, I think a lot of people that have experienced bad things, even if it did not happen here, are hesitant to talk about it.
I wonder if that maybe is a good transition back to this, the idea of the narrative. I think the narrative for the singular incident of trauma is really helpful. I wonder if you could share one maybe related to the complex trauma, the recurring trauma over time.
Well, I get treated like crap all the time because I deserve it. And where this is why, it sounds so Freudian. Well, it's your mother's fault, right? This is why when you have good, consistent parenting as a child, and by the way, kids don't need perfect parents. There's no such thing, fortunately. Kids need good enough parents that are attending to their needs, that are emotionally sensitive, that are going to screw up and then apologize for it. I don't like apologizing, so I try to work harder to avoid doing things that I have to. That I don't have to apologize for. But so if you have a child that has a good, solid sense of self, they're less likely to incorporate this idea of I'm damaged, I deserved it. In fact, when you take a look at sexual predators, when they look to groom potential victims, they're looking for the kids that already look like they're struggling. They're easy prey because it's easy to tell them, I'm the only person that loves you. I'm giving you this special attention, and they're starving for it. And so it speaks to how important it is for children to have a sense of self and security. I think that there's nothing more powerful than for a child to know you can go out into the world and it doesn't matter what happens. You could fall on your face. You're going to come home. We will love you. We will pick you up. We'll brush you off, and you're going to go back out there and do better next time. Instead of being afraid of coming home with a report card that you're going to be told, oh, here we go again. Yeah, I know, another idiot in this family, right? So when a child comes into the situation, the training situation, with some sense of self and security, they're at an advantage. But it doesn't mean that they're bulletproof. See how I did that for you? It doesn't mean that they're bulletproof. And so, yeah, they might have a good sense of self, but everybody knows that this teacher is the most celebrated teacher that everyone kind of worships. Those people, those coaches promise the world, regardless of whether or not they deliver it. And now, even though mom and dad say they love me and I know they got my back, they think this person's the best instant sliced bread too. And so now if this person is starting a campaign, whether they're trying to hurt me or they're trying to get me to greatness, but they're attacking my character, and my self-esteem might be pretty good for an 8-year-old kid, but none of us could withstand constant barrage. I worked with a former Olympic gymnast, and she was telling me the story of how she worked with some of the most verbally abusive coaches that Eastern Europe had to offer. And she was surprisingly unscathed. I was like, wow, this is a tough girl. I'm scared of her, right? And I said, how did you do that? And she said, I had a coach who warned me, you're going to find yourself dealing with coaches that will be horrible over a long period of time. I said, okay, so you were prepared for it. Then what? No, that's not the important part, Doc. What they told me was, These people are in power because they're technical experts. They're horrible as humans, but they're technical experts. When they're doing all of this loud, rah, 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 ignore the volume. Listen for the correction. Because the correction is where the brilliance is. And if you can get to their correction, they're actually giving you great advice. The problem is it's coming through a wall of fire. And so it's a very powerful dynamic that she taught me about. And I said, yeah, that's great, teaching people to listen for the correction. But the narrative for the type 2 trauma, when you're dealing with a teacher that is always on your back, and especially if it's like if you're a dancer and you're with a part of troupe, so it's not just one-on-one, it's also shaming you in front of other people, maybe criticizing, oh, looks like you had a lot to eat this weekend, or of course you can't do that. Everyone else is flexible and you don't give a shit, so you don't put the work in, right? And of course, we're also even more sensitive if the criticism has a little truth to it too, right? But this happens over time, and it's not just a one down situation where I can go, that day sucked, flush it, move to the next day, recover, come back, fresh start. Because the truth is, coaches can have bad days, the same way as all of us have bad days. And I think the best situation is if a coach can say, listen, you know what? I was really hard on you yesterday, disproportionately to what it called for. And I apologize for that, and I'm going to be more mindful about it because I was having a shitty day and you just happened to be there. This was about me, not about you. Now, if you can apologize and change your behavior, then things can carry on in a better direction. The worst thing you can do is apologize, then do the same exact thing, because then you're gaslighting the kid and they're crazy making. They don't know what's going on. But when you have the situation where you have a bad outcome and you hope the next day is going to be better, and it's actually worse and worse. And even worse than it continuing to get worse is every now and then there'll be a decent day that gets thrown in there that makes you think you're crazy. And so the way the narrative starts to get developed is not a bad thing happened to me. Bad things happen to me because I deserve it, because I'm worthless, because I'm not nearly as talented as most of the people here. I'm unlovable, I'm fat, I'm stupid, I'm young, I'm whatever. And it's all self-denigrating language instead of the positive affirmations and believing in your best version of you. You know, it's like if we often talk about, I'm not asking you to be the best, I just want you to try to be better than you were yesterday. And if we focus on that process, you're going to continue to improve. The kind of the imagery that I think of with regards to that is the swimmer who's swimming in a pool, right? And I think that if we can make a lot of money, you and I know it. We're going to develop pools with the clocks on the bottom of the pool, so you know exactly how fast you're going. But if you're swimming and you're beating the two people on either lane to you, and you're kicking their ass, and you think that you're the best thing since sliced bread, and now you're getting out of the pool, you're banging your chest, and these people just barely prevent themselves from drowning. They're horrible swimmers. You think you're the best thing ever. Wrong. Same way as you're wrong when you're swimming next to two people on either side and they're several body lengths ahead of you. But what you don't know is they're Olympic swimmers and you're swimming your best time ever and you think you suck, right? So much of this has to do with improving on your last performance because that's the benchmark that you work towards. But it's difficult because performance is often considered in the context of others. And it depends on if you're a soloist or if you're in an orchestra. It's different if you're in a team sport versus an individual sport. So there's variations off this theme, but it's very hard to continue to get up on that horse when you believe it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what I do. She's going to say more bad shit about me. She's going to tell everyone how horrible I am. And, coaches are not supposed to be cheerleaders only, but that is one of the jobs. It's one of the jobs. And, but it also depends on the personality of the people. I remember there was a kid that I worked with, and he was a basketball player. He was only like 10 years old. And he came in grinning from year to year. And I said, wow, I haven't seen you this happy in a long time. What happened? He goes, well, my coach finally came around, and I'm thinking he's going to tell me a great story. I said, well, what happened? He said, at the end of the game, he smiled. I was like, that was it? He goes, you don't understand this guy. This guy never smiles. And so the context of what is praise depends on what the coach or the teacher's style of sharing that information is in the first place.
It's my impression that when we've internalized this narrative that we're broken or worthless or not deserving of X, Y, or Z, that it's really hard to change that because we can always find evidence to support this narrative that we have internalized. And
Yeah.
in some ways, maybe we're even sort of incentivized to hang on to that because then everything makes sense in the way that it always has.
A broken identity is better than no identity. And then there's a self-fulfilling prophecy that goes along with it, because then if I'm going to suck, at least I have some control over it, which is a little less anxiety producing.
Are there specific methods or approaches that are maybe more suited to addressing that than others? Is it something that we can do on our own, or is it something that requires a lot of support? Or are there general approaches maybe you could share that might help understand what the process of shifting?
Well, I think that in the ultimate situation, if all else fails, then yes, go and get help. And it's important to know that there are sports psychologists that are clinically trained and there are sports psychologists that are not. So you might be working with a sports psychologist or performance psychologist, and they're helping you and they're doing great work with improving your performance. But this is more clinical and you're not getting the help you need. Or you might find that you need to go to a clinical psychologist for therapy. But I think that the simplest place to start is doing your own work with two things. Number one, learning how to adjust your moods, because we can't control what happens to us, but we can have impact over how we react to it. And the other thing is to challenge the thoughts that we have. Just as the gymnast who was saying, listen for the correction. I often say, listen for the evidence. Someone says you're so horrible. Really, where's the evidence for that? Is there evidence that you're horrible? Maybe you're not as good as you want to be, but you can't find anybody that's worse than you. And how about you yesterday? Are you improving? Do you remember times in your life that you were more successful than you are right now? Yeah. What were the circumstances? Da, 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 da. Okay. So it's possible, even if it's not happening now. So what you're trying to do is you're trying to attack the cognitive distortions because they're not true, right? Someone's not broken. I remember when I was dealing with someone who was dealing with imposter syndrome, right? Imposter syndrome is this idea that even though you're competent at what you do, you still feel like you're really an imposter and you're just fooling everyone, and it's only a matter of time before they find out the truth. And this guy, pretty high-powered CEO, comes in, he goes, I just came to the conclusion that I'm a fraud. I said, first off, be careful. Fraud is illegal. You go to jail for that. And he laughed. I said, you're not a fraud. You're just flawed, like all of us. And he goes, wow, that rhymed. How'd you do that? I said, just dumb luck. It just happened to us. But the thing that was important is that people are so worried. I'm not perfect. No shit. None of us are. The people that are most effective are the ones that are able to neutralize their weaknesses. It's not that you don't have flaws. You just don't advertise them. You neutralize them. You keep them in the back. There was a young lady that I know, happens to be my daughter, who has an unbelievable ability to just let things roll off her back. And I don't know how she gets it, because she didn't get it from me. She didn't get it from her mom. And I said to her, I said, how do you do that? How is it that you don't? I mean, I don't think I've seen her upset for anything for more than a half hour in her life. And her answer was so anticlimactic. It was so simple. It was beautiful. She goes, well, I can't change what already happened. I said, yeah. She goes, I got shit to do. I was like, she's like 15 and she's like, I can't change what happened. All right, I was upset for a few minutes. I can't change that. I'm moving on with my life. I'm moving on to the next thing. Now, on the one hand, it's a little bit naive, because people that have had traumatic incidents happen to them have this constant fear that the demons are going to catch them from behind. And the truth is, you can't outrun those demons. You have to turn and beat the crap out of them. And the way you beat the crap out of them is you face them and you master your trauma. And if that means starts with your own work of challenging these distortions, looking for the evidence that disproves what's going on, learning regulation skills so that you're more emotionally balanced, using your emotions and learning to harness them. I mean, is there anything more powerful than someone telling you can't do something to motivate you to do it? Right? And so if you can't do those things on your own, then seek some help. But the truth is that people deal with difficult things all the time and they're not traumatized by it. Another question that may be floating around your head, because people ask this fairly often to me, is, are we dealing with a more fragile population than we used to be? And I think the answer is yes. It's the price that we pay. It's like if you're storming the beaches of Normandy, you want the stoic man. That's what you need for that job. What we've come to appreciate is that if relationships matter, we need to improve people's emotional intelligence. And what goes along with emotional intelligence also is empathy. And as we become more empathic and more sensitive to others, we tend to also be more reactive to others. And so I do think that we're a little bit more fragile, a little bit more reactive, as Alison Pope Brodius often says. People are just so precious, that I think that we're a little bit more sensitive than we used to be. And that's the price that we pay for having better relationships. So I think it's a reasonable price, but it's also important to realize that just because you might be more sensitive, another phrase in trauma is, it may not be your fault, but it's still your problem, right? The world doesn't care that your boyfriend just broke up with you or you got into a car accident. You're supposed to get on stage and sing your butt off right now. Everyone's paying tickets. They paid for the ticket. They're not going to go, oh, she had a bad day? No problem. When it comes to performance, at the end of the day, you have to be able to get up there and do your thing. Whether that's because you compartmentalize everything out of the way, some people do that. Some people just kind of absorb it and go, yeah, and, all this happened and I'm still here. But the best performers are the ones that find a way even through the tough times. And I say this very cautiously because some people might hear what I'm saying as insensitive. But I don't think we help people that are fragile by rewarding them for their fragility. I don't want you to be fragile. I want you to be sensitive. There's a difference. Fragile is easily broken. Sensitive is aware and responsive to your environment. And I want people to be resilient, because the more fragile you are, the easier it is for you to be hurt and traumatized. And why are some people more resilient than others? If we could bottle that, we'd make a whole lot of money. We'd make Starbucks go out of business. There's a lot of factors that go into it. I do think a lot of it has to do with our sense of self in the context of others that comes from parenting and early relationships in life. But it's also not true that because we had great parents, we're impervious to everything. Or if you're not fortunate enough and you've had insecure attachments as a child, that the rest of your relationships have to be horrible. But as everything else in life, are you willing to put the work in? And if you're willing to put the work in, regardless of what's happened to you, you can make your life better.
I'm wondering, for those who have experienced trauma in the past, is there any impact on performance in terms of their experience of stress? Maybe there is, depending on the situation, maybe it's generalized, but is there any relationship between previous trauma and maybe an increased stress response, perhaps, in performance situations or pressure situations?
It's a very good question, and there's no simple answer because I've seen it go in both directions to varying degrees. There are some people that have had so many horrible things happen to them that they become calloused and desensitized, and they could stand in the middle of a fire when most people would tap out. And then there's other people that prior to this horrible thing happening was like a piece of iron, and now they have difficulty performing things that they did 3 or 4 years ago. And by the way, both of those people need help. Both of those people need help, because the person that's desensitized and standing in fire doesn't realize that they're still getting burned, even though they don't feel it, right? And this other person is going, man, if only the past didn't have to dictate my present. Well, that's up to you. It's the reason why the present is called the present. It's a gift. It's the only one we have any influence over. We can't change the past. We could change the way we think about it or how we feel about it, but we can't change it. In the future, if you believe in deterministic thinking, then it's already decided anyway. But I'd like to believe that I have some free will and influence on how things go. So how things go today has some impact. It's impacted by how I feel and how I go about doing things. So take charge of your life and do what you can. You're not powerless, even though it might feel that way. That's another thing. Just before, when I was saying it's very important to not attack the character, focus on someone's behavior. You're allowed to feel a certain way, but that doesn't mean it's true. You can feel powerless even when you're not. And there have been times in session where I'd say someone, they'd say, I feel powerless. And I call bullshit. What do you mean you call bullshit? I'm not saying you don't feel that way. Stand up. They stand up. I said, how'd you do that? Well, you just asked me to stand up. I said, well, if you're powerless, you couldn't even stand up. Let's try to rephrase that a different way. Maybe you're not powerless, but you're not as powerful as you would like to be. And they go, yeah, I'm fine with that. Now it sounds much more optimistic. Let's get to work.
I've talked to some teachers who get new students in the fall, and they're sort of mystified sometimes by the students' response to criticism. You know, they think they're being as thoughtful and as objective as possible and not blaming the student themselves, but again, the behaviors of the strategies that the student's using. And students sometimes will even acknowledge that, no, it's not you. Like I have difficulty with receiving feedback or things like that. And that may or may not be trauma related, but for teachers who are, again, sort of mystified by their students' reactions, both to instruction, but also to performance, perhaps, are there things that you would suggest teachers look out for, aside from sudden changes or unexpected behaviors, that maybe would help them better understand how to engage with these students and be helpful to them?
Well, you set the stage with a certain lane that I'm walking down. So using that type of teacher as the example, never underestimate the value of trust, and that trust takes time to develop. And people that have had traumatized pasts may never trust you, but even if they do, it's going to take longer. So I think there has to be a certain amount of patience. And I can think of a couple of people off the top of my head that are very similar to the way you just described it. And one woman I was working with, she was kind of beside herself because she thought that she was like, I'm like clay. I mean, I'm like a pillow of feathers for them to land on. And if I say anything, she responds this, and this way. And it may not be my fault, but it's still my problem. I'm like, yep, that's the trauma thing, right? It's not your fault, but it's still your problem. And I said, it's important for you to be kind to yourself, because you can't pour from an empty cup, right? So you got to be kind to yourself and recognize, I'm good at what I do. I'm being sensitive. I'm not aligned with this person the way I'm trying to be. But if I can be patient and kind with myself, I'll find a way in. Because that also gives them permission to be kind and patient to the frustrating student. I think that people don't talk about this enough. It is perfectly fine and normal for the teacher to get frustrated, if not annoyed, by these very talented people that are coming to them, and they're not getting better because they can't get out of their own way. Yeah, that is frustrating. It's even more frustrating for them, by the way. But if you can own the fact that it's frustrating, then you can recalibrate your expectations, change your timeline, have a little patience. I think that sometimes there's great variability in coaches and teachers' understanding of how people learn, that very often you need a setback before you could spring forward. 2 steps forward and 1 step back is still progress. One bad day doesn't make a bad season. And I mean, in some ways we've already got the problem solved, because if the teacher's aware of it, they already have some self-awareness that many people don't. But I think that patience is really important. Similar to trust is loyalty. I believe that loyalty is the glue that holds all teams together. The reason why loyalty is so valuable is the same reason why diamonds are. It's rare. And if you have someone who's come from a horrible background and learned person after person that I'm supposed to be able to trust has betrayed me, stabbed me in the back, threw me out, it's like the ruined dog. You go to the dog pound and this dog has been beaten by several different owners, and now it's biting the hand that feeds you. Well, that's what they've learned. This is what the world is. So if you have a student, regardless of how talented they might be in their instrument or whatever their skill is, but they've had all of these things happen to them, do you have any idea how hard it is to build any trust? For them to have any sense of loyalty that you're going to stand through the storm with them when everyone else has not only not, they've thrown you out into the fire. Understanding that this is a product of what happened to them. And they're going through something very profound. And you can use your skill to help you get through it. I remember I did a presentation with Amanda Leibovitz, who's a wonderful sports psychologist. And she presented with me on her trauma, things that she had gone through. And she was talking about how she used exercise as a way to treat herself. And she's also one of these people that's just like gifted in a way that annoys you. Like someone says, hey, you want to run a 10K? And she's like, okay. And then she wins. She never ran before. She wins 10K the first time. So she's physiologically gifted to begin with. So I said to her, I said, Amanda, tell me, I always love when I ask a brilliant question and I didn't plan for it. I said, when you were running, were you running away from something or were you running towards something? And she said, that's actually a very interesting question, because early in my treatment, I was running away from stuff. Now I run towards that. And so we can use practice, performance, exercise as a place to utilize this excess ball of energy that's consuming us to do amazing things. If we normalize it, if we allow ourselves to, if we chose to make this our superpower instead of our super weakness, you can get people to do amazing things. And it's very hard for a teacher or a coach to get people there, especially if they've had traumatic backgrounds, if there's no trust and loyalty. And that takes some time. Everybody has burned me before. Why should I believe you? You just met me. You shouldn't trust me. That would be stupid. You'll see. And there's a common phrase that we use in sports psychology, be where your feet are, right? Where you are, know your job, do what you're supposed to do, and everything will be okay. Well, sometimes the analogy is be where you are and let the process happen. And that includes failure. And that's why, we spend so much time focusing on process goals. It's like if I see an athlete that I'm working with and I'm watching film, I'm like, wow, you really played lights out. Like, what are you talking about? We got killed. The outcome of the game wasn't what you wanted it to be, but you executed everything every goal that you set for this game. Check, 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 check. You do that, the game will take care of itself, even if it didn't happen that day. And the more we reward the process, the more it generalizes to other places. It's the same thing with trauma. We have to retrain them of a different narrative. Things have always sucked, they're gonna suck. Or maybe you've already had enough bad shit happen to you. You're due for greatness. Let's go get it.